Marcel Fontaine stopped the take and announced the replacement while Brigitte Bardot was still standing under the lights on stage 3. He didn't address her. He addressed the room. 40 crew members, operators at their stations, production assistants along the walls, and delivered the decision as already concluded, already entered into the schedule, already beyond discussion. Everyone on the floor understood what that meant. The stand-in would replace her. The session would continue without her. But what happened next on that stage stopped the production in a way no scheduling decision ever had. Marcel Fontaine stood beside the camera position, with one hand resting flat on the open shooting script, his voice carrying across stage 3 at the level pace of a man delivering a decision he had written down before arriving. The script was open to the pages covering the scenes under discussion, its marked lines and sequence notations visible to anyone within reading distance, and 40 people held their positions in the stopped configuration around him. The announcement was not directed at Bardot specifically. Fontaine addressed the floor, the crew along the walls, the operators at their equipment, the production assistants with their clipboards, in the same tone he used to communicate any production adjustment, procedural, flat, without inflection that would invite debate. The stand-in decision was stated as concluded, entered into the schedule, communicated to the relevant departments. Bardot stood in the performance area with the stage lights still on above her, the crew at their stopped positions in the surrounding space. She had not moved since Fontaine called the halt, not her feet, not the angle of her body, not the position of her hands at her sides. The shooting script on the stand behind Fontaine was open, its spine toward the performance area, its marked interior pages facing the room. The stage floor had not resumed. Equipment operators remained at their stations with their hands near their instruments, but not engaged. The production assistants along the walls had stopped writing in the seconds after Fontaine began speaking, and the stage held the stillness of a working floor interrupted mid-session by something without a simple procedural resolution. If you're interested in untold stories from cinema's golden age, subscribe now. This is a fictionalized dramatization inspired by real public figures and historical settings. It does not depict a documented event. By 1958, Brigitte Bardot had appeared in more than a dozen films and generated more press coverage than most working directors accumulated across entire careers. The critical consensus around her was built on image and public presence, not craft, and had been restated so consistently across so many venues that it had acquired the stability of a settled position rather than an ongoing argument. Marcel Fontaine's authority on a working stage was a different register entirely. He was a Gaumont director whose decisions defined the official record of every film he made. What was shot, what was kept, what was replaced. His assessment of a performer's technical capacity, delivered in a production context, was not subject to public debate. It was operational, and it was logged. The Studios de Boulogne were a working production facility, and the 40 people on stage 3 that afternoon were professionals whose livelihoods were connected to the records of the productions they participated in. A replacement decision announced in front of them was not a private note. It was a production fact delivered in a room full of people who would carry it when they left the building. The shooting script on the stand was the primary working document of the production. Fontaine's markings, the scene breakdowns, the take assessments, it sat open while he spoke, its sequence numbers legible, its authority established by every prior session in which it had been consulted. This stage and this announcement constituted a record that did not require press coverage to become permanent. The people present would remember what was said, in what terms, and in what room. Fontaine turned back toward the script stand as he continued, his hand returning to the top of the open pages with the deliberate placement of a man returning to a reference he has used throughout the session. He located a specific sequence number with a brief downward movement of his eyes, his finger pressing gently against the line before he looked back at the floor. The overhead stage lights caught the edge of the open page where his finger rested, the white paper bright against the marked text beneath it. He described the technical grounds for the replacement in production scheduling language, sequence timing, coverage requirements, the specific closework scenes affected. The language was neither harsh nor apologetic. It moved through each point at the same pace, and his hand remained on the script throughout, his palm flat, his fingers relaxed against the surface of the page. Several crew members stopped writing and looked toward the performance area. 2 camera operators turned from their equipment toward the floor, their shoulders rotating away from the cameras they had been attending, their faces reorienting toward the stopped stage. A grip near the side wall uncrossed his arms and let them fall to his sides, his weight shifting to both feet evenly. Fontaine moved through the revised schedule, scene numbers, coverage sequence, the point at which the day would resume after the adjustment was logged. He indicated the production coordinator would log the change and that the floor should hold until confirmed. His voice maintained its production floor cadence without variation, each item delivered at the same pace as the last. He looked down at the open script once more, A direct consultation. Eyes to the page, a pause of 2 or 3 seconds before he raised his gaze again, before closing his remarks with a single sentence indicating the session would proceed following the hold. His finger lifted from the page and settled again at the lower margin of the script, holding the cover flat against the stand. The crew along the walls were watching Fontaine and the performance area in steady alternation, their attention moving between the 2 points at intervals that had shortened since the beginning of his remarks. A production assistant near the far wall had stopped moving entirely, her clipboard held at her side with both hands, her feet planted on the stage floor and her eyes moving between the script stand and the performance area without settling on either. 2 camera operators near the primary camera had turned completely away from their equipment, a full reorientation, facing the floor between the camera and the performance area. One of them had his hands loose at his sides, the other held a lens cap in one hand, the small disc turning slowly between his fingers without his eyes dropping to it. A crew member near the lighting board set his clipboard down on the board's edge without looking at where it landed, the soft contact of the board producing a brief flat sound in the quiet stage. A lighting technician placed his adjustment tool on the surface beside him and withdrew his hand from it slowly, leaving it resting on the flat surface with its handle facing toward the floor. The production coordinator near the stage entrance had her clipboard raised and her pen above the page, but her wrist had not moved since Fontaine's first sentence, and the pen tip remained suspended above the blank line without descending. All eyes turned as Bardot moved. She had been standing without movement since the halt, and now she was crossing the floor directly, continuously, her path aimed at the camera position and the script stand beside it, without deviation or any preparatory shift of weight before the first step. Her direction was unambiguous before she had covered a quarter of the distance, and the sound of her steps on the stage floor reached the walls and came back as the only movement sound in the room. Fontaine was at the stand when she reached it, his body already reoriented toward her approach, his hand still resting on the open script. He did not step back from the stand or move his hand from the page. The document was between them, open, marked, its sequence numbers visible on the facing pages, its spine toward the performance area she had crossed from. The overhead light above the stand fell directly onto the open pages, casting no shadow across the text. Bardot placed both hands on the open shooting script, her left on the left page, her right on the right, and pressed them together in a single clean motion that brought the covers toward each other and closed the document. Without separating the action from the close, she turned the script so its cover faced downward and set it flat on the stand surface with a brief, definite placement, the soft impact of the cover against the stand producing a sound that reached the nearest crew members. The sequence numbers, the markings, and the facing pages that had been visible throughout Fontaine's remarks were now pressed against the stand surface. The room went quiet, at a depth the stage had not reached during the session, not the procedural quiet of a held take or a technical pause, but the cessation of ambient sound that a working space produces even in stillness. The low hum of equipment, the small movements of 40 people, the background noise of the studio building beyond the stage walls. All of it reduced in the seconds after the script closed and settled face down on the stand. Fontaine stood with the closed document in front of him. His hand had lifted when Bardot's hands made contact with the pages, and it remained elevated at the height it had reached in the moment the movement beneath it began. Fontaine's suspended hand descended toward the face-down script and stopped above the cover without contact, his fingers at the level of the closed spine and his palm facing downward. He held that position for a visible interval, his arm extended, elbow slightly bent, the hand neither advancing toward the cover nor retreating from it, and then his eyes moved from the script surface to Bardot's face, a direct look held without speech. Several crew members along the walls shifted their weight without leaving their positions. The production assistant who had stopped near the far wall completed one slow step toward the center of the floor, her foot placing itself quietly, and held the new position with her clipboard still at her side. 2 camera operators near the primary camera exchanged a brief look, less than a second, a mutual glance that completed without words, and returned their attention to the stand, both of them watching Fontaine's suspended hand above the face-down script. The production coordinator lowered her pen from above the blank page, the tip coming to rest against the clipboard's metal edge rather than the paper. She held the clipboard flat at her side, the page facing inward against her hip. Her gaze was on the stand. Fontaine looked from the script to the full-stopped configuration of the floor, a single sweeping look that took in the crew at the walls, the operators away from their equipment, the empty performance area behind Bardot, before bringing his eyes back to the stand surface and the closed cover. His hand settled slowly back to his side, the descent gradual and continuous, his fingers spreading slightly as the arm lowered and the hand came to rest against his leg with the fingers open. The closed inverted document remained on the stand between them. A grip near the side wall shifted his feet, moving them from a narrow stance to a wider one, his hands finding their way into his jacket pockets without a deliberate gesture. A second grip 6 feet from the first watched this happen and then returned his own attention to the front of the stage. The lighting technician moved a half step back from the board, the movement bringing him away from his equipment rather than toward any other point in the room. The production coordinator stepped back until her shoulders made light contact with the wall behind her clipboard held across her body now rather than at her side. The overhead stage lights, which had remained on the performance area throughout the halt, produced a visible pool of illumination across the empty floor between the camera position and the back wall, a column of light with nothing in it. Nothing on stage 3 had returned to its pre-halt operational state. The equipment was untended, the floor was stopped, and the script was face down on the stand. The stage held the silence of a room in which the expected next action has not arrived and no one has taken the step that would initiate one. 5 seconds passed. Fontaine's right hand moved back toward the stand, a slow extension, his arm coming forward from his side at the deliberate pace of a man reaching for something he intends to take, and stopped short of contact, his fingers above the edge of the face-down cover without curling around it. He looked at Bardot. A line of muscle along his jaw tightened and released. His fingers hovered at the level of the cover's edge without descending further. 10 seconds passed. A camera operator near the primary position took one step toward the stand, his weight transferring forward in a movement that began with clear intention. Fontaine raised his left hand toward the floor in a brief flat-palmed gesture, palm outward, held for 2 seconds, then lowered. The operator's forward foot came back to its original position without completing the step. Fontaine's left hand came down to his side. His right remained near the script, the fingers still loosely extended above the cover's edge. 15 seconds passed. The production coordinator moved away from the wall toward the stage entrance, a deliberate walk, not a drift, without having written anything on her clipboard. As she moved, a sound assistant near the equipment rack turned to watch her cross the floor, the small rotation of his head producing a visible change in the orientation of the faces along the back wall. Fontaine turned from the stand and addressed the floor in a single short sentence indicating a production hold, shorter than any sentence in his earlier remarks, delivered without consulting the script, without looking at the stand, and without returning his hand to the cover before stepping away from it. The script remained face down on the stand throughout the hold. The equipment hummed at its background level. No revised schedule for the stand-in configuration was circulated on the floor, and the production coordinator's clipboard stayed blank on the subject for the full duration of the hold. 2 production assistants spoke briefly near the sidewall during the hold, their voices low and their exchange lasting less than 30 seconds before both of them fell quiet and returned their attention to the stand. The session resumed without reference to the replacement decision. Fontaine addressed the floor in the standard resumption language, named the scene to be shot, and indicated the setup. The scenes he had cited by sequence number during his earlier remarks were shot in the original configuration, Bardot in the performance area, crew at their positions, and the first take of the resumed session was called without mention of the adjustment the production coordinator had not logged. A production assistant moved the script from the stand to the side table during the setup for the third take. She carried it in the closed and inverted position it had been in since Bardot placed it there, one hand under the cover and one hand steadying the spine, and set it down on the side table in the same orientation without opening it or turning it over. The sound of it settling onto the table surface was brief and flat, and the 2 crew members nearest the table looked at it when it landed and then looked away. The shooting script had been open on the stand throughout Fontaine's remarks, marked, referenced by number, held under his hand while he delivered the replacement decision to 40 people on the floor. It ended the session face down on a side table, placed there by Bardot in the same orientation she had given it when she closed it, and it had not been turned face up or reopened before the production resumed in the configuration the decision had declared replaced. The session that followed it did not include a stand-in.